I'm Atul Jain. I'm a professor in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in the US. And I do research on climate change, and particularly my interests are related to how the climate interacts with our land processes, particularly, for example, plants, right? How the climate change would impact the plants and how these changes would have an impact on hydrological cycle as well as the carbon and the nitrogen cycle. Anything related to the land and how the land and climate interacts is interest to us. Our study is on a global scale. We look at not only in the tropical or the mid latitude regions, but also we are interested in on the long the high latitude as well. So we were very interested to understand what are the carbon footprint, of humans related to the food sector. Okay, particularly I was more interested in understanding, plant-based versus the animal-based. So far, many studies have, look at this issue in terms of the emissions from the food sector, but really there is a comprehensive study to look at plant-based and the animal-based, and on a global scale our interests were not only about looking at the plant-based versus the animal-based, but also looking at the production versus the consumption on a global scale. And this is the first study looking at the emissions for three major greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, which is the major one, but the two additional important greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, at a spatial scale. And the major finding of our study is that obviously the animal based food contributes the most in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. Our total greenhouse gas emissions from the food sector is about 17 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent. What I mean by equivalent is combining all three gases: carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide. And to this total, about 57% comes from the animal-based food, and half of it, approximately 29%, come from the plant-based food, and the rest come from the other non, plant-based and animal-based, the plants. Okay, so in this study, we develop a framework, data modeling framework. It has a two component, data and models. And our model actually studied the emissions at a spatial scale, not only looking at the CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, but also the interaction of these, the gases with environmental factors. So, for example, as the climate would change, the plant productivity is going to change, right? As the CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere, it also going to change the productivity of the plants. More CO2, more photosynthesis, and higher uptake of CO2 by the plants, right? At the same time, humans are also disturbing the land. So we also account for the human factor in terms of the land cover and land use change in our models. Okay. And another factor which we also consider is, the beyond farm gate. For example, we also consider, the emissions from beyond farm gate. For example, how much is the emission because of the production of the fertilizers? How much emissions from mining of the material which is used for the fertilizer, as well as transport, as well as no the processes of the food once it is being produced from by the farmers. I was a bit surprised in terms of the total amount of emissions which come from the plant-based, sorry, animal-based food. And also, we look at about 170 different crop commodities and about 16 different plant animal-based commodities. And I was a bit surprised about that how much of these individual commodities are contributing to the total emissions. This is a good question. Uh, Personally, I'm a vegetarian, but this question has to be addressed in much broader sense after considering the research which is going to require to control the greenhouse gas emissions from the food sector. Because there are many other aspects of this study uh, which we have to further look at it in order to address this question. Um, the a scientist as me could only actually convey to you that how much of the emissions would be required to control the climate change or accomplish certain goal such as the Paris Agreement. But when the question comes to mitigation, we have to think beyond the science of climate change. We have to think of socioeconomic aspects, but also the cost aspects. In this case, we have to also consider, the macro and micronutrients deficiency and how we can accomplish or fulfill that deficiency if we really want to go in the direction or follow the path of mitigation by shifting the diet from animal based to plant based food. There are two aspects of this problem. One is the production side of this issue, and other is the consumption side. I think the media and others are more focusing on the consumption side, but I feel there is a lot of potential to control the greenhouse gas emissions from the production side. Actually, our study is mainly focusing on the production, so I can talk a lot more about what are the potential to control the greenhouse gas emissions from the production side. For example, there are many there are many agriculture activities which can be managed to control the greenhouse gas emissions. So, for example, our study shows that the soils contribute approximately 14% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, and the farmers can apply some of the management techniques what we call regenerated the practices such as no-till method. As you know that when farmers plant this crops, they plow the soil, and actually the carbon which is stored in the soil goes up in the atmosphere. But now there are some well established management techniques by which they need not to till the land, and all the carbon which is stored in the soil could remain in the soil, and that emission can be controlled. Okay. Another aspect would be you can think of farmers burn the debris, the residue part of the crops, right? It's a big issue in most of the country, not only related to the climate change, but also it's a big issue related to the air pollution. And there are many management practices which farmers can use to control that burning of debris. Perhaps it could also help the soil fertility as well. In terms of the nitrous oxide, which is actually comes mainly from the fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer use, there are many management practices the farmers can use. What we call you know uh, managing the nitrogen at right time application as well as the right amount. And this is the one of the biggest actually concern in most of the developing countries where the nitrogen is overly used and also not applied at the right time. Perhaps by using this management techniques, the nitrous oxide emissions can also reduce. In terms of the methane, which mainly come from the anaerobic fermentation, from the livestock's stomach, because they produce methane. Okay. And now there are some methane inhibitors which can be added to their feed, and those inhabitants can control also the methane emissions. So this is the plant-based side of practices which perhaps can control the greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of the consumption base, obviously the major issue is your diet, right? And the diet, if you're serious about climate change, definitely you can think of changing your diet, maybe not more emission intensity diet you can eat, but you can also eat some less emission intensity diet. For example, you can switch from beef to maybe chicken, right? And you can also switch from the beef to maybe pork. So there are many, many other options available to us, right, which can help to control the greenhouse gas emissions. First, the most important is climate literacy. Okay, so we should be aware about what are our carbon footprint, what our activities are contributing to the climate change. If we are concerned about climate change, that definitely all individuals should take some action to control the greenhouse gas emissions. But if you really want to accomplish the bigger goal, then something bigger, the policy, options should be introduced in order to control the greenhouse gas emissions. More effort has to be made on a country or maybe in a world national scale or global scale, in order to make the people aware about this problem. That's the bottom line. Policies only would work if the people are concerned you know about their you know life in the longer term, and they feel that the climate change is going to impact them in a negative way. This is a very good question. In fact, actually, this is a very important question if we really want to go in the direction of plant-based food. Okay, you have to first understand how much of the land is currently being used to produce the plant-based and the animal-based food. Okay, about 35 to 40% of the land currently being used to produce the plant-based food. About 30% of the cropland, I'm focusing on the cropland, is currently being used for the animal-based food. Okay, and the rest, actually, this is all total cropland I'm talking about. And but there is also a grazing land, okay, which is approximately 70% of the total, the grazing land, or grassland, is being used for for the animal based food 100%. And the rest of the cropland is used for actually other, the plants production, for example, rubber or maybe cotton. Okay, so if you really want to shift from the animal based to plant based, right? So that land which currently being used to produce the animal based food would go back to the plant based food. I doubt that we would have this issue. We have already done some analysis, and our study shows that there is enough agricultural land to produce enough food which could fulfill the demand, at least for protein. I would not able to say more about the other micro and macronutrients, because we also have to think about the deficiency of other micro, and how the humans can fulfill that, and what kind of foods the humans should consume to overcome that, the macro and micronutrients. But deforestation currently is an issue because in Brazil most of the food goes in the animal base production. So that's why there is a more deforestation. But if the Brazil is serious about shifting from animal based to plant based, there's plenty amount of land there to grow the crops which could actually fulfill the demand of protein. So my major concern is that so far the focus is on the energy sector. I think if you really want to, if we are serious about the climate change control, we should think of emissions not only from the energy sector but also from all sectors which are contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions, including food sector, because food sector is contributing about one third of the total man-made greenhouse gas emissions. So there are many options, as I have already discussed. Few of them, are available on the table, and we should seriously think about controlling the greenhouse gas emissions, not only from the energy sector but also from the food sector. By the way, I have not mentioned it, but about 60% of the total greenhouse gas emission from the food sector come from the CO2. You know, so CO2 is still a major greenhouse gas, in the case of food sector emission as well. So if you really want to accomplish the goal of net zero emissions, obviously we would not able to do it unless or until we take some action to control the greenhouse gas emissions from the food sector.